Okay, so welcome and thanks for joining in this session on Buddhist symbols on the Stupa, a symbol of the Buddha, a symbol of enlightenment, but also the largest of all Buddhist symbols because it's an architectural symbol. So I'm going to share the screen and show you some images of stupas. And then at the end of the slideshow, we'll come back together and there will be a chance for any comments you've got, any questions you've got. So I hope you find it of interest. So if you've ever traveled in Buddhist countries, you must have seen stupas. Every single Buddhist country has its own stupas. And this one is a Sri Lankan one from Anuradhapura, one of the most sacred and holy sites, Buddhist sites in Sri Lanka. And just have a look at it. Have a look at its scale for a start. Some stupas are absolutely enormous. The Buddhist flags are flying. There are always pillars. There's a railing around it. And we have this great dome. We have, in this case, a square structure on top of the dome and then a spire and various other things on the top of that. And people are going up to the stupa and they'll do their walking meditation. They'll walk around the stupa, perhaps chanting, and then they meditate near it. So it's a bit like a cathedral in Christian countries or a great mosque, but there is an obvious difference, at least with this one and with most of the southern Buddhist stupas, which is that you cannot go inside. So isn't that interesting? It's a cathedral that you always stay outside of. And you're in the open air. Now, one practical reason for this is because we're talking about hot countries where people are happy to be in the open air, where the weather is good, except for in the rainy season. And this means that enormous crowds can gather at stupas. And especially on the full moon and new moon day, the local stupa would be the place where all Buddhists would gather together to practice, to listen to Dharma talks, and also, as we'll see later, to worship the stupa. To pay reverence to the stupa. We'll see why that should be. So imagine these huge crowds, but also think about the relevance for you of these sacred buildings in your own country, and how this is for Buddhists to have a sacred place. The place you're in has a big effect on your state of mind. I was thinking of this. I was thinking of my own rather dingy, rather plain classroom when I was at school. That is where I learned. It wasn't an inspiring place to learn, but somewhere which is designed both to be beautiful, to be impressive, and also to have an enormous symbolic significance. That's going to have a big effect on you when you try to do your practice or when you try to learn about Buddhism. Now, the very first stupa that I ever saw, I was actually part of its inauguration. It's a very small part. I was in the procession. And there was a huge procession going down through groves of cherry trees, headed by an elephant, with monks from Sri Lanka, monks from Thailand, and monks from Japan, and nuns as well, and many ordinary people, some carrying banners, some carrying fruit and offerings. And I'll show you this stupa as the next slide. And if you haven't seen it before, you might not be able to guess where this one is. If you have seen it before, you say, oh, I recognize that. We won't have a quiz about it. And this great pagoda here, this great stupa, is overlooking a lake. And the lake is called Willen Lake. And the location of this stupa is in Milton Keynes. It was one of the first stupas built in Europe. An impressive big stupa inaugurated in 1980 at a time when I was living in Milton Keynes. And I remember seeing the monks who built it. It was built not by contractors, but by Japanese Nichiren Buddhist monks. And I can remember them with enormous energy carting wheelbarrow loads of concrete, getting these huge, beautiful carved friezes on the sides in place. And then during the ceremony, sort of very senior monks came over from Japan. Various dignitaries were there as well, the mayor and so on. And there was a ladder going up to the top of the spire, and a monk shinned up this ladder. There were flags flying as well. There were streamers and banners everywhere. And the monk shinned up this ladder to the very top of the stupa, carrying a small casket. And according to the organizers, this casket actually contained some of the ashes of the Buddha himself, which had been donated by the Sri Lankan government for the stupa. I don't know how true that was, and if so, I don't know how many grams of the Buddha's ashes were there, but they were dropped into the stupa. And this is what gives us a clue as to the origin of the stupa. These were relics being put into what's known as the Peace Pagoda, the Milton Keynes Peace Pagoda, but it is a classic stupa shape, although rather a mixture of Southern Buddhist and Japanese forms. The roof is very Japanese, the rest of the stupa is very Southern, including the lions guarding the main staircase. And you can see the platform there where you would do your meditation practice, do your circumambulation, the circular platform around the stupa. And then the platform for ceremonies is the great paved platform, the square one in front. So if anyone says, where is the Buddha buried? You could say he's buried in Milton Keynes, or at least a bit of him is. And this was an issue for Buddhists. Here's one of the nuns, the Nichiren nuns there at the stupa. Yes, it was an issue for Buddhists when the Buddha died, is what should they do with his body? And they decided to cremate it. He was asked about this before he died, and he said, well, don't worry about it, he said to his most dedicated disciples. You get on with your own practice. You can just leave it to people who are interested in that kind of thing. But in general, he said that an awakened one, or a great disciple, a hearer of the awakened one, or even a great ethical monarch in ancient India would be buried in a mound, a stupa. And according to one Tibetan source, when his followers asked, okay, what do you mean by that? What would it look like? It said that he took off his cloak, known as the outer robe, and he folded it to make a rectangular platform, and then he inverted his begging bowl and placed it on top. So there was a square platform with a hemispherical dome. And he said, well, something like this, that would do, wouldn't it? But it's probably more likely that they were just copying what was already done for kings and dignitaries, and even maybe great religious figures in India, even before the time of the Buddha. Because after all, the burial mound is a classic way of commemorating rulers and so on throughout the world, in fact, and has been for thousands of years. So because everybody wanted some of the Buddha's ashes, rather than just making one mound, they made 8 mounds in all neighboring kingdoms, and 2 more were made, in fact, one for the jar that the ashes had been put in, and one for the embers of his funeral pyre. So 10 stupas, according to tradition, were built for the Buddha. And soil was heaped over the ashes, and then the ashes were covered in unbaked bricks. And this is what the first stupas looked like, a mound. So I just want to go back a bit before the Buddhist stupas and have a look at these ancient burial mounds. So this is an artificial mound. This is the tomb of Midas, so it's said. Midas, whose touch turned everything to gold, from the 8th century BC in Greece. And so, yeah, you can see this thing of rulers being buried in great mounds. And this is particularly the case if the local religion was an earth religion, an earth goddess religion. And in India, these mounds were called a womb mound, or an egg mound even, they were called. And you can see these connections with the female principle and with the earth goddess, and the returning, in a way, at the end of your life, returning to the womb, even returning to the egg of your evolutionary history. And we can go even further back than this. If we go to Ireland, 3200 BC, this is the Great Mound at Louth. That's, to give you an idea of the scale, you can walk into it. And an even huger mound made in Ireland, rather heavily restored, is Newgrange, which I visited. It's fronted by quartz crystals, so it catches the sun and glows. And you can walk in to the chamber, and from the very back of the chamber, on Midsummer's Day, I think it is, Midwinter's Day, I think it is, the sun illuminates the back of the chamber. So as well as the earth, we're also celebrating the sun. And there was another kind of religion around at the same time as the Earth Mother or Earth Goddess religions. And if we think of India in particular, this was brought in, it's said, by the invaders from the north. And this is the religion of the sun, based on fire, based on gods of the sky. And the ceremonies there, rather than burying people in the earth, the ceremonies were sacrifices held on an altar unto the village tree. So it's probably oversimplified to say that people were having to choose between these two types of religion, but there was some kind of a dilemma, a dichotomy going on in ancient India. Do we have an earth goddess religion, or do we have a sky father religion? Do we burn our offerings and let the smoke ascend to heaven, or do we bury them in the mound of the earth? And which one do we want? These two were opposed. But Buddhism decided to unite them. Let's just have a look at a fire ceremony by a Brahmin, a Hindu. This is the religion that was brought in by the invaders around 1000 BC into India. And that's within a temple, but then outside, under the sacred tree in the village, ceremonies will be performed involving a fire. So what the Buddhists decided to do was to unite the two, to unite the earth goddess and the sky deities. Here's another shrine, a tree shrine, the tree involved with the sky religion. And this is actually a Bodhi tree, but it's not a Buddhist shrine. And here is the basic form of the early stupas. So you'll find the mound, but you'll also find something on top of the mound. And in this case, it's a square enclosure with a three-tiered umbrella or parasol on the top of the enclosure. So the early Buddhist stupas had a basic platform at the bottom with a mound built on that platform, and you could walk around the mound on the platform at the bottom with a railing around it. And then on the top of the mound, there would be a fire altar known as the harmika. And this fire altar meant that if you cremated the person, the great leader, the enlightened teacher or whatever, on the top of the mound, their ashes could simply fall from the fire altar down a shaft into the center of the stupa, the center of the mound. And then the parasol on the top was the symbol of sovereignty in ancient India. So by this stage, we've actually got 4 elements in the stupa. Probably every stupa has at least these 4 elements. There's the base, where you walk around the stupa. There's the mound built on the base. There's the harmika, the enclosed square area or square platform on the top of the mound, which could have a fire built on it. And then finally, you've got the royal parasol on the top. So 2 earth elements and 2 fire or sky elements united together. And the parasol, of course, is also analogous to the tree that tree symbol. And so every stupa would have a wooden shaft going through the middle of it. And this was known as the Meru Danda. And Danda means a shaft or a stick, and Meru means the world mountain. And so it was sort of symbolizing the world axis. So the stupa, wherever it was, would make you feel central. This was commemorating the place very often. And in fact, the 8 stupas that were built for the Buddha's ashes and the 2 others for the jar and for the embers of the fire, these were, according to tradition at least, these were each built in a place that was special to the memory of the Buddha. His birthplace, the place of his enlightenment, the place of his death, the place of significant elements in his life as well. And so if you go on a pilgrimage to Buddhist India or to other Buddhist places, you'll always find stupas marking the place of significant events, a place you can visit, a place you can practice. So this one, the Great Stupa at Sanchi, was started in the 3rd century BC, but maybe there was one there from the time of the Buddha, we don't know. And you can see here the 4 elements and the spire in the middle, the chatras. I think that's misspelt actually, but the chatras is the parasol, the harmika is the fire altar, the hemisphere, the dome, and the drum at the bottom. And here's another image of Sanchi, and you can see the railings around the edge with these beautiful torana, they're called the gates, which are carved with scenes, which include scenes of old stupas, which gives you an idea as to how the stupa was used in the old days. So the stupa represents integration. It represents a progressive integration of the earthy parts of us with the sky or fire parts of us. It's not just to do with reconciling ancient religions, it's to do with reconciling the different parts of ourselves. The upward moving, ascending, soaring part of ourselves, the inspired part, but also maybe sometimes the ungrounded, the unbalanced part of ourselves. But also the earthy part, the grounded, the solid, the rooted parts of ourselves as well, but also maybe sometimes the rather stuck parts of ourselves, the rather morose parts of ourselves. So they both have positive and negative elements, and to bring those out, they need integrating until complete enlightenment, which reconciles them finally. But also the stupa commemorates the Buddha, represents the Buddha. And we saw in one of the earlier slideshows that in early Buddhism, they didn't actually have statues of the Buddha, but you could say they didn't need them because the stupa itself was the statue of the Buddha. It wasn't trying to show what the Buddha looked like as an Indian human being. It tried to show the Buddha's mind, the enlightened mind, the fully integrated mind. A monument for him representing his consciousness, a pagoda of consciousness. Now, every Buddhist country built stupas, and they would commemorate their own great religious saints, if you like, and they would also mark special places, or they would be simply a place of pilgrimage, and there in any temple. And the style in each country changed. It developed its own style very much, its own beautiful architectural style, and it would be a wonderful thing to do a journey, to visit the stupas of different countries and to have a sense of what it tells you about maybe the cultural particularities of that country, the aesthetic preferences of that country, the artistic heritage of that country. So this is Sanchi in India, and this is a slab from another very early stupa, Amaravati, in the British Museum, showing what a stupa would look like. So you can see the elements of the stupa. You can see the gateway. There's an image of the Buddha there in the gateway, so it's late enough to have a Buddha image. The lions on the pillars at the gateway. you can see just about make out a sort of a railing behind which you would do your walking meditation. 4 pillars in front of the stupa here, carvings on the side of the stupa, and then nets, sometimes nets of flowers, nets of streamers, even nets of jewels covering the stupa, and then the harmika at the top, little square area, and you can just about make out a single parasol on top of the harmika, the fire altar. Now, if we move to Sri Lanka, we saw that white stupa at the very beginning, and the stupas are often absolutely vast in Sri Lanka, and they have the classic shape here. You can see here, though, instead of just one umbrella, you start to have a little bit of a spire. The umbrellas have turned into a notched cone on the very top of the stupa of the mound. And then here we have another Sri Lankan stupa at night. And this would have been a spectacle of a stupa right from the very beginning. It would have been covered in lights on the full moon and new moon nights. And everybody from all around would troop there to do their practice. So especially in the days before artificial light, imagine how magical that would have been to visit, maybe in the depths of the jungle, maybe outside the local temple, outside the town, outside the village, and from a distance to see the white-robed lay Buddhists streaming towards the stupa, and you can see the glow of it in the sky, covered in little lamps all over, each in their niches. And then when you got there, you would venerate the stupa. And here's an image on the left of this drawing of a carving. You can see people with folded hands kneeling in front of the stupa, or standing or walking around, even playing musical instruments perhaps. And maybe draping the stupa with colored cloth as well, playing music. You'd offer incense, you'd offer candles yourself, you bring them along, you'd offer flowers, you would circumambulate, do your walking meditation, and then somebody would give a talk, would give a Dharma talk to educate you about the Dharma, and that would be your practice. The holy days for Buddhists were the full moon and new moon days, in other words, every 14 days, and that's when Buddhists would gather together, come together from all over the local area. And even elephants, even animals would venerate the stupa according to Buddhist tradition. So here's 2 elephants coming to visit a stupa. Again, this is in India again at Amravati. And more lights. This is the famous Buddhanath stupa in Kathmandu in Nepal, lit up at night. It's still lit up at night on special occasions. Another thing you can see here is the streamers, the flags. Tibetan stupas and Nepalese stupas always have these streamers with Buddhist flags flying from them, but that also seems to be something that was there in the earliest days. People would tie ropes to the very top, and from that they could have decorative streamers running from the top of the stupa. It must have been so much fun decorating your local stupa, making a special journey to it, bringing all your friends and meeting them there. And here's another one much closer to home. Here we are, the lights at the stupa at Padmaloka, the retreat center in Norfolk. Sorry, you can't see the stupa itself very well there, but it's a classic stone stupa. And there it's in a courtyard, and you can do walking meditation around it, light incense, light candles. And inside it are the ashes of the great Tibetan teacher, Dado Rinpoche, one of Sangharakshita's teachers, who lived in Kalimpong, also lived at Bodh the Buddha's enlightenment place, for a while, and ran the temple, the Tibetan temple there. And then here we're back at the Milton Keynes stupa, showing on a special holy day there, the Japanese monks and an elaborate shrine for worship in front of the stupa. They love piles of fruit. They used to have piles of, people would bring along tins, so they have piles of baked bean tins on the shrine sometimes at the Milton Keynes one, or even tins of corned beef for those that didn't realize that Japanese monks are vegetarian. And then another one in Britain. This is actually at Tara Loka, the Women's Retreat Centre in Shropshire, and it's a stupa made of paper. This was, I remember I was here, I took this photo myself, which is why it's not a very good photo, but at least you can get a sense of it. A stupa made of paper and lit from inside. Everyone sitting around meditating or doing a puja, doing Buddhist chanting. Isn't that beautiful? So it's a very important element of Buddhist practice, is the stupa, venerating the stupa as representing the enlightened mind, and also practicing at the site of the stupa and meeting the Sangha at the stupa. So far we've seen Indian stupas, we've seen Sri Lankan stupas, and we've seen a few rather mixed style stupas in Britain. But let's have a look at some other countries, because if you go to Thailand, the stupas soar. They really want to reach the sky. They may be saying, I don't like being an earth mind, I'd like to be more like a rocket. And so up they go, these lofty stupas. And this one I think is at the Temple of the Emerald Buddha in Bangkok. And then if we go to Myanmar, Burma, again, soaring spires on the stupas. The form is still there, you can still recognize it, can't you? But the style has changed a lot, with little stupas all around it, and gilded. This is in both Thailand and Myanmar. They love to gild the stupas, and people would bring along little squares of gold leaf and go up there and add another square. Another Myanmar one in Bagan or Pagan. And Pagan, I'd love to visit it. I've not been there myself, but it's a plain that is absolutely covered in stupas. Hundreds and hundreds of stupas at Pagan, in different styles from different periods. In East Asia, the stupas retain that wish to move skywards. Here's one, sorry, there's one in Laos, Romania and Southeast Asia, yes. Very unusual style, that one. But again, you'd walk through the gates there and you'd be able to circumambulate inside. Yeah, so if we move to East Asia, China in this case, we get what Westerners call the pagodas. And the pagodas, they almost seem to lose the burial mound. They just retain the spire, which is very interesting. They lose the whole huge base. It's as if the planet itself, the Earth itself, becomes the base of the stupa. They say, we don't need this. We're on the Earth anyway. We'll just build the spire. And the other change that comes about is that you can go inside. So you get story after story, each of them with graceful curved roofs. And there's always something representing the parasol on the very top of the spire. In Japan as well, a very distinctive style, but still the pagoda. You see the what's left from the parasol is this. There's this spire on the very top, like a lightning conductor. In Vietnam as well, we get that style. Graceful up-curved roofs. But somewhere in these cooler countries, these rainier countries, somewhere inside where you can shelter, where you can have a temple. And then here's another one, a little quiz for you, except I haven't got a chance for answers, but do you recognize this one? Chinese style pagoda. And this one is in London. This one is in Kew Gardens. And it's worth visiting. And staying in London, we have a Japanese style stupa. by the river here in Batsu Park. And this one was built by the same Buddhist sect, the Japan Buddha Sangha, they're called, as the one who built the Milton Keynes stupa, but a little bit later on. And it's a more traditional Japanese style one than the Milton Keynes one. But both of them have the standing Buddha proclaiming his enlightenment in the front. And back to the Milton Keynes pagoda as well, you can see the difference in style. They're just the single roof. And on each side of the Milton Keynes one, there's an image of the Buddha at a different stage in his life. Here he is teaching in the deer park, teaching his first 5 disciples with some other people listening in, and a deer, or a number of deer. And these were carved in a traditional way by Indian craftsmen or craftsmen. Now, the most extraordinary stupa in the world must be this one at Borobudur in Java, which I have had the great fortune to visit. This is absolutely enormous. It's basically is a whole hill encased in stone, carved stone, all intricately carved. And on the top of this 4-sided stupa, you have dozens and dozens of smaller stupas and one great central stupa. And the smaller stupas, you can see there from above, from the air, the form of it. And you can climb up. You can either climb straight up the staircase that you can see in the middle at the bottom, or you can go round and round in a spiral through successive galleries. And there are 4 sets of enclosed galleries, and then you emerge on the very top and you can see the view around you. It's in a rural part of Java with volcanoes on the horizon. Very, very dramatic place for a stupa. And there on the top, the stupas there are perforated, and the one nearest to us here has damaged. And so you can see that inside it, there's an image of the Buddha, the image of Vairocana Buddha with the teaching gesture. And on each side of the stupa at Borobudur, there are Buddhas, dozens and dozens of Buddhas. Amitabha, the red Buddha of the West on the western side, and so on, all going around. Wonderful place, Borobudur. So it's a vision of the mandala of the 5 Buddhas, as well as being a stupa. And there's a lot of connections between the mandala and the stupa. And that's what it looks like on the plain, surrounded by paddy fields and jungle. In the mist in the morning. Really absolutely magical place. One of the greatest stupa in the world, certainly in terms of size, and beautifully carved with thousands of carvings depicting the life of the Buddha, depicting stories of Buddhist pilgrimage, and all sorts of things. These friezes that you can look at as you walk through the galleries, enclosed, not over the top, you're below the sky, but you can't see out because the carvings are above head height. And it will take you, even if you walk fairly quickly, it'll take you at least 3/4 of an hour to do the circumambulating until you reach the top. So it's like a meditation practice in itself. And you could take many hours if you look carefully at the carvings as you go. Now, what about Tibetan stupas? So here's an old Shoten in Chanbush in Tibet. And you'll see they have their own distinctive style. And in fact, here, the base has got quite large. So sometimes they do have a room inside where you can go inside. And the dome has become more like a jar, more like a vase. It's no longer just a dome. It's actually moving outwards as it goes up. And that's not a window there, that's an image. So you'll have an image there sometimes. In this case, it's a painted tanka that's been hung on the stupa. And above that, a notched cone, a spire. And then a little remnant of the umbrella, and then a moon and a sun, and a drop on the very top. And I'll say more about this in a minute. And they're all over the landscape in Tibet and in the countries around Tibet. That one more traditional, with a proper dome instead of a vase shape. The Brahmaputra River originates, I believe, in Tibet and then flows down into India. And here, Tintin in Tibet, Tintin, the cartoon figure from Belgium, when he visits Tibet in this particular book, he finds a stupa, or more than one stupa, and his friend Captain Hayek succeeds in damaging it. They meet Tibetan monks there who say a little bit about Buddhism. It's worth a read, Tintin in Tibet. And here's a drawing showing the standard, or one of the standard Tibetan styles of stupa. Actually, there are several styles, but most of them do have this vase shape on them. And the Tibetan stupa is a teaching aid. It teaches the whole path to enlightenment. It shows the structure of human potential. It symbolizes enlightenment, but it also shows everything that leads up to enlightenment that you need to build up. You're constructing a basis for enlightenment. And here are the 8 traditional types of stupa, corresponding to the 8 stupas built after the Buddha's death. But this is a Tibetan tradition as far as I'm aware. And only the one representing the parinirvana, which is the name for the Buddha's death, has the dome shape. Or you could even call it a bell shape, couldn't you? A bell-shaped stupa. The others have a vase shape. So by bringing the unconscious parts of yourself into awareness, you are making spiritual progress. You're building in your imagination the lower levels of the stupa as you do this. And then once you've established that basis of integration, of being more conscious, a more aware person, a more mindful person, then you can build the higher parts of the stupa, which represent meditative states, higher states of consciousness. And then at the very top, everything comes together in wisdom and finally complete enlightenment. So the first thing that we have is a square or sometimes a round base, which is terraced and which you can walk around. And this is the firm, earthy foundation in the natural world. It's an acceptance of one's own ordinary nature, your emotions, your desires, the body and its needs. And then as we move upwards, the mass reduces step by step. It focuses. The stupa is a symbol of focusing towards a single point. So instead of the dome in the Tibetan stupa, we have this pot or vase shape. And this is the natural world as receptive to higher states of mind, like a vessel. So in the original symbolism, you could say we've got lunar symbolism, moon symbolism at the bottom, sun symbolism towards the top. So the earth goddess religion was very much based on the moon, while the sky religions were based on the sun. And Buddhism tried to integrate the two. So the pot is the ethical phase of life. It culminates in gathering all one's conscious energies in meditation. And then in meditation, you have this notched cone, which in Tibetan stupas has 13 notches in it, representing succeeding higher levels of meditation or spiritual progress, or some say the powers of the Buddha, but something, many, many different kinds of symbolism. That we can say successively higher states of consciousness achieved through meditation, but firmly grounded, firmly based on one's real experience. You can actually see a lotus blossom, by the way, opening, and the cone, the notched cone emerging from that lotus blossom. So this is a solar phase, a sun-based phase, an active phase. It represents vertical integration. and then the parasol at the top, which represents a sort of a barrier, doesn't it? If you imagine if you were climbing up the spire, then your head would get stuck inside the parasol, and it would be quite a difficult thing to overcome. And this represents a change of dimension from just being through higher states of consciousness. You can't break through in an ordinary way. You can't just hammer away at it. You've got to change your dimension to the transcendental, in other words, to insight. And what we find on the Tibetan stupa when we get through, magically go through the parasol, we then find the crescent of the moon. We've returned to the lunar symbolism once again, but now on a different level. And the moon here represents the soft and gentle compassion of the Bodhisattva. And then a sun disk, a solar symbolism again, but again on a different level. Enlightenment or Buddhahood as a principle that's outside time, wisdom in its fullness, the shining light, the bright light of the sun. So the stupa is the whole Buddhist path, a natural ground. Out of that emerges the ethical life, living the ethical life. Out of that emerges meditation. Out of that emerges wisdom, and finally enlightenment. And you'll recognize maybe the threefold path there: ethics, meditation, wisdom, founded on a ground of genuine human nature, culminating in the freedom of enlightenment. You could also imagine this as the stupa as an egg in which you drop the Buddha's ashes, which fertilizes the egg, and the egg sprouts or cracks open, and the new being emerges from the egg. This is the sort of psychic symbolism of the stupa. But also, if the stupa represents human potential, then surely one can see a human being as a stupa, the human body seated in meditation as a stupa. And so the image on the left shows the way that traditionally the Buddha's body is said to fit inside the stupa. So you'd imagine a human being, usually a Buddha, meditating inside the stupa. His folded legs are the square lower part. The torso is the dome or the pot shape. And then the head is above that in what would have been originally the harmika, the fire altar, with the spire of meditation states rising above his head. And this also means that each of the elements of the stupa contains one of the chakras, one of the energy centers of the body. Chakra means wheel, and there are many different series of chakras, but in the case of the stupa, it'll be particularly the 5 main chakras, the chakras of the human body. And incidentally, this also tells you why Nepalese stupas and sometimes Sri Lankan stupas have eyes painted at the eye level of the body imagined, the human or Buddha body imagined inside the stupa. So we can also just notice, I'm coming back to this later, but notice the geometric shapes on the human body on the right. That's another form of the stupa. So I'm not going to give you a chance to read all this. You'll find it online if you want to look it up. But it just shows you the incredible complexity and fascination of the symbolism of the stupa, particularly the Tibetan-style stupa. And you'll see lots of different correspondences of the different levels of the stupa here. But I will just point out one of them, which is the path of, you look along near the left, the path of accumulation, the path of joining, the path of meditation, the path of the path of seeing and the path of meditation, and then the path of no more learning. Oh, that's right, which is on the right of the stupa, the path of no more learning. And this corresponds to the 5 main stages of the path as we teach them in Triratna. So the legs, or the base of the stupa, is the path of integration, accumulation as it's known in the Buddhist tradition. Then the path of union is the path of positive emotion around the torso of the figure and the vase shape. Then we have the path of meditation, also known as the path, we have the path of seeing, which is also known as the path of vision, or the stage of spiritual death. Then we have the path of meditation, the path of spiritual rebirth, the emergence of the new individual, and finally the path of no more learning, the end of the path. So that's rather rushed through, but you could look up that if you're interested in that. The stupa can be a good mnemonic, a way of remembering these different levels of the path in Buddhism. So it's very rich symbolism, but how do you use it all? Here's another one, a little bit simpler. And showing the elements, the element shapes on the left as well. The earth element, the water element, the fire element, the wind or air element, and the element of space. And using the elements is the way in which you can practically, and especially in meditation, make use of stupa symbolism. You could just let the whole thing speak to your unconscious mind and give you its own message. But if you want to be more systematic, you can do meditation practices based on the stupa, particularly the stupa of the 5 elements, or even the 6 elements. So we can look at these elements as states of mind that we can be in. And each of them has both its limitations and its very positive elements as well. And they are successive, they build on each other. They can be regarded as succeeding degrees of freedom as you move towards the top. But they can also, each of them can be seen as a way of being lost in a phase of human development, unable to move on because you've lost touch with the other elements. You need to create a stupa. You need to bring the elements together in a harmonious whole. The earth element is like being stuck, but unable to move, restriction. So in this case, if it's isolated, if it's separated, it's not the nourishing foundation of the stupas. Or at least it's not if you stay there. You've got to be prepared to move above the earth, not just stay with the earth. And then water is a bit more free than being stuck, because water can slosh back and forward if you hold up the washing up bowl. But it represents the dualistic state of moving always between opposites: pain and pleasure, success and failure, loneliness, gregariousness, manic energy and lethargy, and so on. This fluctuating between polarized opposites, that's the water element. Then the fire element, this is rising up. This is very free, very excited, very rapturous, like a firework, maybe getting very idealistic. But the danger here is that you lose touch with the earth and you just end up like a firework in a shower of sparks. Then the air element, the green dish shape, corresponding to the parasol or the umbrella on the old stupa. This represents expansion. You're not just sloshing it out on a level. You're not just rising up, but you're moving outwards in all directions like the air can. And maybe you can be so spread out that you lose your identity, you forget who you are, you become too lost in what's outside you. That's the downside of that. Being very universal, being very one with everything, but undifferentiated, so you don't really care what happens. You think everything's fine. You've got spaced out, a dangerous state to be in. Now you can see these elements on Japanese stupas, in fact, Japanese tombstones. So on the upper left image there, that's a Japanese cemetery, and the memorials for people will be in the form of a stupa. In fact, in the form of the 5-element stupa in a Japanese style. The earth ring, the water ring, the fire ring, the wind or air ring, and the space ring. And the 5th element, the top one, is this element of space or akasha, the shining blue sky or space, the flaming drop at the top of the stupa. So this is what the stupa is trying to do. It's trying to build up a structure of human integration. So you build the elements up progressively rather than getting stuck in each of them. So you can think of how that might work in your own life, how to make sure all those elements are present, starting with the firm and solid earth, and then bringing in the receptive container of the water element, and then learning to rise up, experiencing the heights as well as the depths, inspiration of the fire element in art or poetry perhaps, and then having the expansiveness of air, moving outwards, encountering the new, filling the space around you, and then the single jewel drop of akasha or space, being completely awake in every situation. So I'm going to finish there, though I'm going to finish looking back at the Budnath stupa in Kathmandu, the eyes that show you that inside the stupa is a meditating figure. And I'll finish with a quote, and this is a quote from a beautiful book on the stupa by Lama Angarika Govinda, who was a friend of Sangharakshita's, German Buddhist teacher. It's through the language of archetypal symbols that we reconnect ourselves with the primordial ground from which all human culture has sprung. Among the oldest of architectural forms, the stupa is a universal symbol of enlightened mind, a familiar sight in all countries where Buddhism has flourished. In the stupa, we find the ancient reliquary monuments once built for kings and heroes, transformed into profound expressions of knowledge. Rightly interpreted, understood by both reason and intuition, it mirrors the harmony and perfection of universal principles and invites the human mind to awaken to its full capabilities. So it's a wonderful thing, the stupa, I think. I find it very inspiring to be near a big stupa, or even just to have a little stupa on the shrine. The next time you go into the Buddhist Centre at North London, if you are a North London person, then do have a look at some of the small stupas we have there. And maybe visit Battersea Park, visit Milton Keynes, or visit stupas in Buddhist country.